It's the last week of the NFL season. There are still people out there fighting for fantasy football championships, but let me warn you, it's weeks like this that are an absolute nightmare when it comes to fantasy. We have teams out there resting their starters. We have teams out there playing for nothing that are really looking forward to the offseason, but there are a few teams out there that have exactly what we need. Players that are not only fighting for playoff spots, but extra money. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today. We're talking about quarterbacks. We're going to start and sit here in week 18 fantasy football, but it's not just start and sit advice. Even though there's not a lot of people playing in week 18, we wanted to bring you all the same information, but in a slightly different version. So we're also including rankings in this video as well. So be sure to stay tuned throughout the entire episode so you don't miss out on the rankings. But let's go ahead and dive into week 18 here this week. And there's a few teams that we really need to target. If you have some roster holes, these are the teams you want to pull players from if possible. Teams like the Steelers, Texans, Colts, Jags, Bucks, Saints, Falcons, Vikings, Cowboys, Eagles, Seahawks, Packers, Dolphins, and Bills. But we also have a couple teams that we know really don't have anything to play for and have already come out and talked about resting starters. Like the Ravens, the number 1 overall seed is locked. They're going to rest some players. The Browns, the number 5 overall seed, they're locked into that. They're going to rest some players. Same with the San Francisco 49ers. They're already locked into that number 1 seed. And the Chiefs, they're locked into the 3 seed. Now, we also have the Lions. They're the current 3 seed, but have a chance to jump up to number 2. So they may put forth a little bit more effort. And then the Rams, they're currently the 7 seed. They could move up to the 6, but they've already come out and said, hey, you know what? We're going to rest Matthew Stafford, maybe some other players as well. But let's go ahead and discuss that as we dive into each and every matchup here once again in week 18, starting off Saturday football, the Pittsburgh Steelers, Baltimore Ravens. And what's crazy here is the Pittsburgh Steelers have chosen to continue riding the hot hand of Mason Rudolph. Despite Kenny Pickett being a full go, he's fully healthy. We're still going to see Mason Rudolph. They want to keep him there under center. He's led this team to back-to-back wins now, and this is once again a must-win game for Pittsburgh if they even want to have a chance at making the playoffs. Like we mentioned last week, though, the biggest issue here is touchdowns in Pittsburgh. If we don't get those big play touchdowns that we saw just a couple of weeks ago, any quarterback we throw into this offense is not going to be any different than Kenny Pickett. No big plays last week. He still played pretty good, did Mason Rudolph, but finished as the quarterback 27 overall on the day. Now a matchup going up against Baltimore, and on paper, they allow the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but it's still unclear how many of their starters are they going to sit. It's still the fantasy championship. If you're playing this week, it's for a title, and I don't know if I can trust Mason Rudolph is anything more than a mid to low end quarterback too. But on the other side of the football, we already know we're not going to have Lamar Jackson. We're going to have Tyler Huntley. You have to expect Baltimore to rest even more starters, and I'm not looking at Tyler Huntley to lead me to a fantasy championship here this week. There's a lot better options. Which then takes us out to Indy for the Colts and the Texans. We'll start off with CJ Stroud because this is a must-win game and a Saturday game. That's about best case scenario here this week. Really the only thing going against Houston, it's a matchup against another division opponent that is also in a must-win situation. Houston, Indianapolis, and Jacksonville are all currently tied at 9-7 right now. Now I love that this game is actually in Indianapolis in a dome where weather doesn't play a factor. And these two teams faced off back in week 2. In that matchup, Houston won, and CJ Stroud went bonkers with 384 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, and no interceptions. He also had 47 pass attempts in that game. He didn't have a game the rest of the season with more pass attempts than he did in the last meeting against this Colts team. The Colts, they allow right around 16 fantasy points per contest, and Stroud, once again, is going to be up inside my top 12. On the other side of the football, we got Gardner Minshew, and he kind of finds himself in the same scenario, right? A must-win game, but Minshew has been consistent for the most part all season long. Tough opponents, Easy opponents, home games, road games, doesn't really seem to matter. The guy's going to hover right around 15 fantasy points per week anyway. And really the reason for that is the lack of consistent passing touchdowns in this offense. Only 4 games all year long has he had multiple touchdowns passing in a game, largely in part not to going deep down the field consistently. He's currently the quarterback 26 overall on the season in air yards per pass attempt at only 7.2 yards. That really leads to not only just lower yardage, but less overall touchdowns. He's still playing solid, don't get me wrong, he's not playing bad football, the ceiling is just going to be lower. But now in a matchup going up against Houston, they allow over 18 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is 9th most in the league. What we really need to pay attention to here is the offensive line and all of their injuries. Braden Smith, Quentin Nelson, and Ryan Kelly are all questionable to play at the time of this recording. Now you have to expect in a must-win game, they're probably going to gut it out and be out there on the field here this weekend, and given the overall scenario, Gardner Minshew is going to be up inside my top 15 this week. Which will then take us out to Carolina for the Panthers and the Bucks. We'll kick it off with Baker Mayfield because there may not be another quarterback in the NFL with more on the line this week than Baker Mayfield. Not only is this a must-win game, a win and in for the playoffs and the division, but holy incentives this week for Baker Mayfield. Just listen to what he has on the line. A $2 million bonus for making the playoffs. $300,000 for finishing inside the top 10 in the NFL in passer rating. He's currently number 8. $300,000 for top 10 in the NFL in touchdown passes. He's currently number 5. $300,000 for finishing inside the top 10 in passing yards. He's currently 8th. $300,000 for finishing inside the top 10 in completion percentage. He's currently 13th. $300,000 for top 10 in the NFL in yards per attempt, and he's currently 8th overall in the league. This guy is in line for a redonkulous payday if he can go ahead and hit all those incentives. He has something to play for, but this isn't going to be some easy matchup for him. On the road in Carolina, Carolina has nothing to play for, but they haven't had anything to play for in weeks, and they continue to go out there and play great football on the defensive side in the passing game. Plus, you kind of have to think they may like to play division spoiler and keep one of their division mates out of the playoffs. That's a little bit of something to play for because Carolina allows the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks of any team in the league at only 13.2. Baker is also dealing with a rib injury, but sounds like he should be good to go. Baker has thrown multiple touchdown passes in 8 of his last 10 games played, and with so much on the line, you have to think that Tampa Bay is going to want to go out there and start fast, put points on the board early because they know that Carolina offense struggles scoring points. Now, when it comes to the other side of the football and Bryce Young, he hasn't been fantasy viable all year. We're not even wasting the time. We're not considering him in week 18. How about we go down to Cleveland and Cincinnati now? We already know that Joe Flacco is going to be rested. Cleveland is going to be starting Jeff Driscoll. No, we're not starting Jeff Driscoll in our fantasy championships. On the other side of the football, we have Jake Browning. And even though the Bengals really have nothing to play for, I don't hate Jake Browning this week, knowing that Cleveland is more than likely going to be resting multiple starters, not just on offense, but on defense as well. Especially in the last game of the season at home, not really knowing when he's going to get another chance to play football, because you have to expect Joe Burrow going to be back out there next year. Plus, we know that Jake Browning is out there scoring fantasy points each and every week. He scored at least 16 fantasy points in 5 straight games and has rushing touchdowns in 3 of those 5 games. I can't really see him stealing anything on the goal line this week, though, if I'm being completely honest, because Joe Mixon only needs 2 rushing touchdowns to hit a $350,000 incentive. If they're on the goal line, more than likely it's Mixon that's going to get it. A lot of people are going to be scared off of Jake Browning because of the matchup going up against Cleveland, but they're going to totally overlook the fact that most of the starters aren't going to be playing. Jake Browning, he may not be top 10 for me this week, but he's not going to be too far outside the top 12 either. Which will then take us out to Detroit for the Lions and the Minnesota Vikings. For Minnesota, we got Nick Mullins. And here's my issue with Nick Mullins. It really has nothing to even do with Nick Mullins. It's the fact that at one point last week, that staff in Minnesota actually thought that Jaren Hall was a good option to throw in and start that game. That was an absolute disaster. He couldn't even finish it, and we had Nick Mullins starting the second half. What's stopping them, though, in Minnesota from doing something similar? They have nothing to play for in Minnesota, and now they're going up against Detroit at home, who is currently pissed off because of what happened last week and that whole two-point conversion fiasco. If Detroit goes crazy early, we may see a quarterback carousel once again in Minnesota. I try to avoid teams that are doing a weekly quarterback carousel, and we've seen it multiple times now over the last month of the season in Minnesota. Add in the fact that this game is on the road in Detroit, and that fan base is absolutely rabid right now, probably best to avoid Nick Mullins. How about Jared Goff? I have a few concerns here as well, because honestly, once again, it has nothing to do with the quarterback himself. I like Jared Goff. I like the matchup here this week. If this is earlier in the season, I'm probably rolling out Goff 10 out of 10 times. But this is the best shot the Lions have had in a long time to win a playoff game. Their best team since 1991, arguably. Their first division title since 1993. Now, yes, they want that number 2 overall seed in the NFC. But if they fall behind early or get a big lead, you have to expect that Jared Goff could come off the field to avoid injury in what is ultimately a meaningless game for Detroit. If they want to make a playoff run, they need Jared Goff under center. They cannot risk an injury. Because of that risk, I'm going to have to drop him down in my rankings here just a little bit. Out to New England now, though, for the Patriots and the Jets, and there's nothing to see here when it comes to quarterbacks in fantasy football. We're not starting Trevor Siemian or Bailey Zappi, two of the lower-end passing offenses overall in the league. No, we're not even wasting any time here. Trevor Siemian, Bailey Zappi, not interested. So let's go ahead and move down to Atlanta and New Orleans now. Atlanta has something to play for. The problem is we don't even know who the hell their quarterback is going to be, and this is another one of those situations where we could see both Taylor Heinicke and Desmond Ridder. That is not a chance I'm willing to take here in my fantasy championships, so I'm not considering either one of the guys in Atlanta. It's not like this is some high-powered passing offense as is, especially going up against the Saints. I'm just going to pass altogether. What about Derek Carr, though? This is a must-win game for the Saints, playing the same time as Tampa Bay as well, so you know they're going to have to fight for this win. Saints can get into the playoffs if they win this ball game and both Seattle and Green Bay loses. I know they're going to need a little bit of help, but Carr hasn't been playing bad here as of late. He scored at least 15 fantasy points in 3 straight ball games. He faced this Falcons team just a couple of weeks ago, threw for over 300 yards. But had no touchdowns and only 1 interception. Now, on the year, Atlanta is allowing 17.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is not bad. I would be happy if Derek Carr could hit that number here this week. A lot of people are paying close attention to Alvin Kamara, though, suffered an ankle injury, and there's some speculation out there that it could be a high ankle sprain, which could keep him out of this ball game. Definitely something to pay attention to there. How about Derek Carr, though? There's very few times all year long, really, that we could look at Derek Carr and you say, you know what, let's lock him into the top 12. And I really don't think we can say that once again here this week. However, he's not going to be too far out of the top 12. I look at Derek Carr as more of a top 15 option as of right now, heading into week 18. Which then brings us up to Tennessee for the Titans and the Jags. We'll kick it off in Jacksonville with Trevor Lawrence, because you have to think, with this being a must-win game for Jacksonville, they're going to do whatever they possibly can to get Trevor Lawrence on the field for this game, despite dealing with a shoulder sprain. Now, by kickoff of this game, we're already going to know the outcome of Houston and Indianapolis. It was played earlier in the week. But if they win here in Jacksonville, they clinch the division. But we also know that Zay Jones, he's currently questionable, and they just lost Jamal Agnew last week in week 17 with a lower leg injury. However, a lot of people want to know about Christian Kirk. He was designated to return, but that does not mean that he returns this week. Now, if they make it to the playoffs, absolutely that's a possibility. Does he play in week 18 though? We still need to wait and find out for that. A matchup going up against Tennessee though, not the easiest. They allow 15.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. We already know though that we are not considering CJ Beathard if Trevor Lawrence can't go. But what I do know is we probably will not hear for sure about Trevor Lawrence until late in the week. So if he's your starting quarterback, you need to be sure to have a backup option just in case. As of right now, a healthy Trevor Lawrence would be a Verge top 12 quarterback in week 18. As for the Titans, absolutely not. I don't care if it's Will Levis. I don't care if it's Ryan Tannehill. I don't care if it's Malik Willis. It could be a mixture of the three. None of those guys are going to be an option in week 18. But now we'll get to a couple matchups that have some fantasy viable quarterbacks here this week. The first one, Arizona Cardinals, Seattle Seahawks, and for Geno Smith, he definitely has something to play for. Seattle not only needs to win this game, they need a Green Bay loss in order to make it to the playoffs. But Geno is playing for a little bit of an incentive himself. A playoff berth for the Seattle Seahawks would mean a $2 million bonus for Geno Smith, and he's got a great chance to do it here. On the road in Arizona isn't a horrible matchup. Arizona allows 19.4 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Plus, this game is being played indoors, so no worry about weather here, and we know that all the pass-catching weapons in Seattle are currently healthy. Geno has 7 total touchdowns over his last 3 starts, and the big plays going the way of DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith-Njigba are really starting to help his floor weekly. He hasn't scored under 17 fantasy points in any of his last 3 games played. Now that offensive line is still a mess, but it's been a mess majority of the year. With so much on the line here for Geno Smith, he's going to be a top 12 option. Now as for Kyler Murray, the Cardinals haven't had anything to play for in months, and it hasn't stopped them from actually going out there and competing weekly. They absolutely shocked the NFL last week when they went out to Philadelphia and beat the Philadelphia Eagles. Now they have a chance to kill a division opponent's playoff dreams. When it comes to Seattle, they allow 17 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and Kyler has scored over 18 fantasy points in 5 of the 7 games he's played so far this year. Now, Arizona has already come out and said, hey, Kyler Murray is going to be our future franchise quarterback, but that does not mean they're going to sit him in week 18. He's got a total of 12 touchdowns in his 7 games played, and he's doing a lot of it with a bunch of off-brand pass-catching weapons. I'm talking like we're going full-on great value brand here. Not bad, gets the job done, but nothing high-end. Well, maybe except for Trey McBride. That dude is an absolute stud, but he plays tight end, so we're not talking about him here in this video. There is no reason to think that Arizona is going to do anything different than what they've been doing the past couple of weeks, and because of that, Kyler stays inside the top 12. Which then takes us out to Green Bay for the Packers and the Bears, and we'll kick it off with Justin Fields because this is an eerily similar situation to Kyler Murray in Arizona because Justin Fields and the Bears really have nothing to play for, but they have a chance to keep a divisional opponent out of the playoffs and really no reason to not play the same way they have over the last few weeks. Over the last 4 weeks of the season, they've been playing pretty damn well. Justin Fields, the quarterback 4 overall in fantasy football and averaging 21.8 fantasy points per game. Green Bay, they allow only 15.8 fantasy points per game, but Justin Fields is out there averaging over 50 yards rushing a game. Plus, we're starting to see him gain overall confidence in this offense, and he's trying to prove that he is the future in Chicago. I'm looking for Justin Fields to go out there and end on a high note, and he's definitely going to be in my top 10. As for Jordan Love, a must-win game to get into the playoffs. It would also mean a $500,000 bonus for Jordan Love as well. And he really did put together a great season, an Aaron Rodgers-esque type of season. He's going to throw for over 4,000 yards and over 30 touchdowns. A great year. Like I said, a lot of people didn't give him a chance. He proved a lot of people wrong. Now, over his last 7 games, he's scored at least 20 fantasy points in 5 of them. And he's all of a sudden up to the overall quarterback 5 in fantasy football, above guys like Brock Purdy and Patrick Mahomes. Now, he played against Chicago back in week 1, had 245 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, but a lot has changed since then. The Chicago Bears are allowing right around 17.2 fantasy points per contest to opposing quarterbacks. The biggest issue here is the health of his weapons. We know that Christian Watson is basically perma-hurt, but Dontavian Wicks and Jayden Reed are questionable to play as of right now as well. It is great to see that Jayden Reed and Christian Watson did make it back to practice on Wednesday, though. Maybe in a limited form, but definitely something to pay close attention to as we head into the weekend. But good news so far. You have to think this is a must-win game. Those guys are going to gut it out and be out there on the field, and that's going to be enough to keep Jordan Love inside the top 12. Which then takes us up to LA for the Chargers and the Chiefs, and honestly, not a whole lot I'm interested in here. Patrick Mahomes going to be rested. They're starting Blaine Gabbert. Patrick Mahomes struggles to score points in this offense. I'm not trusting Blaine Gabbert. How about Easton Stick? I would love to trust him a little bit more, especially since the Kansas City Chiefs are probably going to be resting some of their starters. But in 3 of the 4 games that Easton Stick has played at quarterback, they've resulted in 0 passing touchdowns. That is just not something I want to try to trust in my fantasy championships. He does kind of have a low-end quarterback 2 type type matchup, so if you're in a 2-quarterback league, I don't hate him as your second option, but with Keenan Allen and Josh Palmer still questionable, there's a lot of risk there. Which then takes us out to Vegas for the Raiders and the Broncos, another matchup I'm not interested in here in fantasy football. Jarrett Stidham, Aiden O'Connell, neither one of them possess a ceiling that's going to help win you a fantasy championship, and their floors are crazy low. Neither one of them are considered in Week 18. Which will then take us out to New York for the Giants, and the Eagles will kick it off with Jalen Hurts because this is a game they need to win. They also need a Dallas loss to clinch the division. Oh, how the mighty have fallen, and all of a sudden, the Philadelphia Eagles look average AF. They've lost 4 of their last 5 games. Over that span, Jalen Hurts has thrown for 5 touchdowns. 3 of them just came last week against Arizona. Only has 1 game with over 300 yards during that span. However, continues to have one of the safest fantasy floors there is because of his rushing upside and rushing touchdowns. He has 4 of them over his last 5 games played. He's the overall quarterback 2 right now in fantasy football, and despite the struggles of the teams, Jalen Hurts continues to go out there and be just fine in fantasy. Now a matchup going up against the Giants. They allow over 16 fantasy points per game, and the Giants were their only win over the last 5 weeks, so that is definitely a good sign. It is also worth noting that Devontae Smith is questionable to play with an ankle injury after being injured in Week 17. There's still plenty of other options for Jalen Hurts to throw to. He's still a top 5 play as of right now. As for Tyrod Taylor and the Giants, not somebody I'm considering unless it's a low-end quarterback 2 at best. He hasn't played bad the last couple weeks, and I do love how he's pushing the ball down the field more so than we've seen all season long in New York. But I'm not trusting him in a game going up against Philadelphia that is a must-win game for Philadelphia. There's just better options than Tyrod Taylor. Which will then bring us out to the Bay, San Francisco and Los Angeles. It could be Matthew Stafford and Brock Purdy, but instead, it's Carson Wentz and Sam Darnold, and honestly, even though these are 2 guys that will be inside my top 24, they're not 2 guys that I want to trust win me a fantasy championship. We know the Rams are resting Stafford. If that's the case, you have to think at some point in this ballgame, they pull out Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua and Kyron Williams as well to keep them healthy. They're already locked into the playoffs, right? We know that they're going to be there. They need to be healthy once they get there. And I'm not going to trust Carson Wentz when he hasn't started a game in like a year. On the other side, it's Sam Darnold. Similar to what I said with LA. If they're resting Brock Purdy, you have to expect the likes of Christian McCaffrey, who we already know about. We got Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle. These are all guys that may not play a full set of snaps. That's going to hurt whoever plays quarterback, not just Sam Darnold. And that's why, huge risk, somebody I'd prefer to be my low-end quarterback 2 at best. Which then takes us out to Washington for the Commanders and the Cowboys, and this game is being played at the same time as Philadelphia is going, so Dallas is going to have to go out there and try to win this game and bring home the division title, and what a great matchup to do it going up against Washington. They allow almost 21 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, some of the most in the league. Dak, the current overall quarterback 4 in fantasy football. I will say this though, if Dallas does get a big lead, they could pull him early in that game. Hopefully by that point, he's already racked up enough fantasy points to give you a great fantasy day. On the other side for Sam Howell, this dude could be benched at any time. He hasn't done anything in weeks, and I'm not trusting that situation in Washington to be any different in Week 18. Too much risk for me to consider starting Sam Howell. Which then brings us to Sunday Night Football, the last game of the week, the Buffalo Bills at the Miami Dolphins, a game in which I'm going to be at. I will be there in Miami for this game. Looking forward to that, of course, because the winner of this game wins the division. Now, we already know that we're going to start Josh Allen. He's the overall quarterback 1 and has only scored under 20 fantasy points 4 times all year long. Now a matchup going up against Miami. They allow almost 18 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but they still really haven't been able to get Stephon Diggs going in this offense. Better late than never, right? They're going to have to try to this week. Now, something definitely to pay attention to here, it's supposed to rain all weekend in Miami. Of course, the weekend I go to Miami, it's going to rain all damn weekend. However, the weather reports are showing that the rain could be done close to kickoff, but pay close attention to that because there's no planet in which we don't start Josh Allen when they need to win a ball game. How about Tua on the other side? Now, this may not be an ideal matchup for Tua, but being at home in a must-win game, is definitely a plus. Now, I know we really haven't seen the Tua ceiling in quite some time, but these two teams faced off back in week 4. In that matchup, Tua had 282 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and just put up 17 fantasy points last week on the Baltimore Ravens. Now, matchup going up against Buffalo, they allow just over 15 fantasy points per game, but we already know that Miami could be without Jalen Waddle and Raheem Mostert. Definitely pay attention to those two injuries for sure. He's still an overall top 10 quarterback in fantasy on the season though, averaging 17 fantasy points per game. No, it's not the best matchup, but given that this game is at home, primetime football for the division, and with the way that the current landscape looks in the NFL with all the starting quarterbacks who are sitting, Tua's probably going to be in my top 12 this week. Now, speaking of rankings, remember I said at the end of our start sit video, we're going to include our rankings as well. So let's dive into those. Given all the information we just heard, here's how I have my top 24 quarterbacks. On the top, Dak Prescott, followed by Josh Allen, Justin Fields, Jalen Hurts, CJ Stroud, and Kyler Murray to round out my top 6. Then we're going to Geno Smith, Jordan Love, Derek Carr, Baker Mayfield, Jared Goff, and Tua Tagovailoa. You see, he snuck in to the top 12, but barely. Let's go ahead and move on. Number 13, it's Jake Browning of the Cincinnati Bengals, followed by Gardner Minshew, Trevor Lawrence, Nick Mullins, Mason Rudolph, and Tyrod Taylor. And then lastly, 19 through 24, got Easton Stick, Jarrett Stidham, Sam Darnold, Sam Howell, Blaine Gabbert, and Carson Wentz. But that's going to go ahead and do it for my quarterback start and sit and rankings video here for week 18 fantasy football. A lot is going to be different. You can't really look at trends in a week like this. You're just trying to find players that have the most to play for. Hopefully you have enough options on your roster to walk away with a fantasy championship here in week 18. And then in the offseason, you can talk to the commissioner about changing it to a 17-week season so everybody's lives are just a little bit easier. Now we're going to be doing this same format for all 4 positions, so be sure to stay tuned. But now I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you guys have a great rest of your day. Hopefully you had a great new year. And then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.